The sharp whine of the police siren cut through the silence like a knife. Zoe Adams' heart skipped a beat as she pulled her car to the side of the road. She had seen the flashing lights in her rearview mirror, but it didn't fully hit her until she stopped. An unmarked squad car pulled in behind her, its dark windows hiding the officer inside. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her fingers feeling cold and clammy despite the heat of the summer afternoon. She was just a few miles away from the base, just a few miles away from the protection of her team. But out here on this street, she was a black woman alone in a world that too often saw her as a target. The officer stepped out of the car, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark sunglasses that made it impossible to read his expression. The sound of his boots hitting the pavement echoed louder than they should have, like a threat. He approached her car with slow, deliberate steps. She met his gaze through the side mirror, her pulse quickening. She knew this was coming. They always did. "License and registration," he barked, his tone flat and dismissive, as if he already knew she didn't belong here. Zoe didn't move immediately, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She had dealt with this before. The questioning looks, the subtle shift in body language. She was used to it, but this was different. This time, the weight of the officer's presence felt heavier. As she reached for her glove compartment, she could feel his eyes on her, judging her, sizing her up. "You're a little far from home, aren't you?" The officer's voice cut through the tension, and the words were too casual, too loaded. Zoe's grip on the papers tightened. But before she could respond, a sudden realization swept over her. This wasn't just a random stop. This wasn't just routine. He was doing this because of who she was, because of what he assumed her life was worth. The officer reached for his radio. She froze. "Everything okay, officer?" Came a crackling voice from his mic. Zoe's heart skipped as she read the officer's lips. "Got one here. Not sure, but I think we have a special one." Zoe's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. The faintest hint of recognition passed between them. He didn't know who she was. Not yet, but he was about to find out. The swish of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound that accompanied Zoe Adams as she drove down the empty highway. The summer air was thick, the kind that wrapped around you like a heavy, damp blanket. The road stretched out ahead of her, familiar, but somehow different tonight. She had just left a tense meeting with her team, an urgent debrief on a covert mission, and now she was heading home. It had been a long day, longer than most, but Zoe was used to the wait. She'd learned early in life how to carry it. Suddenly, the flicker of red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror, pulling Zoe out of her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat, the sudden rush of adrenaline making her grip the steering wheel a little tighter. She blinked, trying to shake off the initial shock. This wasn't the first time she'd been pulled over. She slowed her car and pulled to the shoulder, the sound of the tires rumbling against the gravel punctuating the silence. In the rear view, she saw the dark shape of an unmarked squad car pulling up behind her. Zoe's mind went to work. Nothing unusual, just a random traffic stop, she thought. But the cold knot in her stomach wouldn't loosen. She'd been pulled over enough times to recognize the pattern, the way the officers always looked at her, the way they always assumed. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It wasn't just the badge or the uniform that made her nervous. It was a subtle undercurrent of prejudice that ran through every encounter like this. It was always the same, her skin, her hair, the way she carried herself. It didn't matter who she was or what she did. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out of the unmarked car. His posture was stiff, like he had something to prove. He moved with a deliberate slowness, as though he wanted her to notice every step he took. His sunglasses reflected the dim light, hiding his eyes. That only made Zoe more alert, a sharp instinct waking up in her gut. He approached her window, his boots crunching against the gravel. Zoe's breath hitched slightly as she rolled it down, letting the hot air rush in, but her mind was elsewhere, watching, waiting. License and registration. The officer barked, his voice rough-clipped, as though he expected her to already be trembling. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her. Not a glance. No, it was more like he was sizing her up, as though trying to figure out where she belonged. Zoe's fingers twitched on the wheel. She was already reaching for her glove compartment when he added, You're a little far from home, aren't you? The question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. It wasn't an innocent inquiry. It wasn't even subtle. It was a challenge, a declaration that she didn't belong here. He was putting her on the spot, testing her, judging her. She froze. The question wasn't about the road. It wasn't about why she was driving through this particular part of town. No, this was about her, about who he thought she was. Zoe's voice was steady when she replied, "I'm just driving home." But the officer wasn't listening. His gaze didn't soften. Instead, his lips tightened and the cold stare of his sunglasses never wavered. The unsettling silence stretched between them like a taut wire. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. She didn't want to make any sudden movements. Didn't want to give him any excuse to escalate things. The officer's fingers twitched at his belt, where his radio sat. He seemed to take a moment, as though making some sort of decision, a pause that dragged on too long. Then, the soft crackle of the radio broke the silence. "Everything okay, officer?" The voice on the other end was faint but clear, the question laced with just enough detachment to make Zoe's skin prickle. "Got one here. Not sure, but I think we have a special one." Her stomach churned at the words. Special. The way he said it, so casual, so sure of himself, stirred something deep inside her. The officer's gaze flickered to the side, then back at her, as if he was checking something, confirming something. Zoe knew what he meant. She didn't need him to elaborate. She could already feel the weight of his assumptions bearing down on her. Before she could respond, he was already speaking into the radio again, his voice growing colder. "I'll need backup, just to be sure." Zoe's grip tightened on the wheel. Something was off. She didn't know exactly what, but she knew this wasn't going to end like every other stop. Her heart raced. She wasn't just a black woman sitting in her car anymore. She wasn't just a random driver to him. She was a target. She could feel the entire weight of that realization settle in her chest like a stone. The officer's eyes bored into her, but she didn't flinch. The radio crackled again. The voice was distant. "You sure about this, officer?" "Yeah, it's definitely her. We'll be fine. Just need to check a few things." Zoe's breath caught. Her, that single word, loaded with meaning, filled the space between them. The officer's next words made her heart skip. "Special one, all right." Zoe's thoughts were racing now, trying to figure out what that meant. Who else knew? How had they connected her to this moment? But before she could process any further, the officer took a step back, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. The world seemed to stop. He knew, but he didn't know her. Not fully. Zoe's mind was spinning, trying to find the thread. But she could feel the danger now. The officer wasn't just doing his job. He was playing a game of power. And Zoe had no intention of losing. But she couldn't help but wonder, just how far was he willing to go? The officer didn't move at first. The silence between them thickened, oppressive. Zoe could feel his presence, like a weight pressing down on her chest. His hand was still resting on the grip of his gun, his fingers twitching, as if debating whether to pull it free. She didn't make a move. She couldn't. Any sudden motion, even a twitch of her hand, could be seen as a threat. She had been trained to stay calm in these moments. Trained to read the room, to keep her composure under the weight of suspicion and hostility. But no amount of training could prepare her for the steady pulse of fear that now hummed beneath her skin. "Are you just going to stand there?" she asked, her voice flat, almost mechanical. The officer took a step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel again, deliberately slow, as if to remind her the power imbalance. He leaned down, bringing his face close to the window. She could smell the faint scent of his aftershave, a strange contrast to the tension in the air. "License and registration," he repeated, his tone now colder, more commanding. The words felt like a chain being wrapped around her wrists, a symbol of everything she couldn't control. Zoe's eyes flicked to the glove compartment, her hand hovering just above the latch. She had to make sure she wasn't giving him anything to use against her. Slowly, methodically, she reached inside and pulled out the papers. Her fingers were steady, but her mind raced. Every move, every word, every breath felt like it was being scrutinized. She handed him the papers without looking him in the eye. She couldn't afford to show fear. Not here. Not now. The officer didn't take them immediately. He stared at them, then at her, as if he was waiting for something, waiting for her to crack, to show him a hint of weakness. His dark sunglasses hid his expression, but Zoe knew better than to think he wasn't watching her every move. "You seem pretty calm for someone who's been pulled over," he said. His voice oozed with something that wasn't quite curiosity, but wasn't entirely disdain either. "Most people get a little nervous." Zoe clenched her jaw. This was a game. He was trying to bait her, to see if she would flinch, to see if he could provoke a reaction. But Zoe had been in high-pressure situations before. Situations where a wrong move could get people killed. This was small potatoes in comparison. "I've been pulled over before," Zoe said, her voice low but controlled. "I know how it works." The officer's lip curled slightly, but he didn't respond right away. He took the papers, flicked through them, and then handed them back with a slow, deliberate motion, like he was trying to make a statement. "I'm going to need you to step out of the car," he said, his voice now cold, commanding. Zoe blinked. "What?" "You heard me," the officer said, his hand still hovering near his weapon. His posture had shifted, becoming more threatening, more assertive. "Why?" Zoe asked, her voice sharp. "You're not exactly in the best part of town, and I don't like the way you're acting." "You're making me nervous," he said, almost with a sickening sense of satisfaction, as though he enjoyed having the upper hand. Zoe's mind raced. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't some overseas operation where she had control, where she could rely on her team. This was a random traffic stop in the middle of a quiet suburban street. There were no cameras, no backup. She was just a black woman in a car, and that was enough to make her a target. The officer's hand moved closer to his gun. "Step out of the car now," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Zoe felt the pulse of anger building in her chest, but she kept it in check. She knew this game all too well. She wasn't going to play by his rules. Not this time. "Why don't you just tell me what this is about?" Zoe asked, keeping her voice even, though the tension inside her was rising. "You've already checked my papers. There's no reason to escalate this." The officer's eyes narrowed. "I said step out of the car. Now." She exhaled slowly, her training kicking in. She knew what this was. She had seen it 100 times. The false sense of authority. The casual abuse of power. He wanted to humiliate her. He wanted to break her down, force her into submission, make her feel small. But Zoe Adams wasn't small. She had fought her way to the top of the Special Forces. She had faced down enemies in hostile territories, navigated complex international conflicts, and come out on top. This was a different battle, but it was one she knew how to fight. She wasn't about to let some petty officer strip her of her dignity. She took a deep breath and leaned back in her seat, staring straight ahead. "I'm not getting out of the car," she said firmly. "You're making a mistake." The officer's jaw clenched. He stepped back from the window, his hand still hovering near his gun, as though he was debating his next move. The seconds stretched long, like the pause before a storm. The tension was unbearable, and for a moment, Zoe thought he might just pull her out of the car anyway. She could feel the weight of that thought, the horrible inevitability of it. But she wouldn't let herself break. And then, almost as quickly as it had escalated, it stopped. The officer stepped back, his gaze still locked on hers, before he finally spoke. "You're lucky I don't make this worse for you," he said through clenched teeth, his voice tinged with frustration. "But if you know what's good for you, you'll get out of the car next time." He gave her one last look, one last assessment, then turned on his heel and walked back to his squad car without another word. Zoe sat there for a moment, her heart pounding, her mind spinning. The weight of the encounter lingered, the officer's words echoing in her head. She didn't know why he had backed off, but she knew this wasn't over. She wasn't going to let him, or anyone else, get away with this. Zoe didn't drive off immediately. She couldn't. The world around her felt like it was closing in, the oppressive heat of the moment still heavy in the car. She sat there for a few seconds, staring at the rearview mirror, watching the officer's unmarked car retreat into the distance. The engine of her car idled in the background, a low hum that felt almost too quiet after the storm. The officer's words rang in her head, a cruel reminder of the reality she lived in. "You're lucky I don't make this worse for you." It wasn't just a threat. It was a casual disregard for her humanity, the unspoken assumption that her life didn't matter in the same way as his. She blinked, forcing herself to shake off the lingering chill of his presence. She had to focus. She had to move. But even as she put the car into gear, the heaviness didn't lift. She drove for a few miles, eyes scanning the road, her mind replaying the encounter. She couldn't help herself. She thought about all the other times she had been forced to swallow the rage, to hold back the protests, the rightful indignation at the system that had been built to subjugate people like her. She thought of all the officers who hadn't backed down when she stood her ground, the ones who had taken her to jail, the ones who had thrown their weight around simply because they could. But none of them had been like this officer. None of them had this cold, calculating power. Zoe's phone buzzed in the seat next to her, breaking her from her thoughts. She reached for it, glancing at the screen. It was a message from her colleague, Derek. "You good? Heard about the stop. We're watching. Keep your head down." Her fingers hovered over the reply, but she hesitated. She could feel the pull of something deeper, a gut instinct she had learned to trust. Derek's message wasn't just a check-in. It was a reminder that someone was always watching, that someone was always ready to back her up if it came to it. She texted back quickly, just one word: "Fine." But she wasn't fine. Not by a long shot. Zoe gripped the wheel tighter as she turned onto the highway, heading toward her apartment. The thought of the officer still gnawed at her. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that he could take control. He had assumed that his power was absolute, that he could intimidate her into submission. But there was something she couldn't shake, something darker beneath his words. She thought about his last words, how they had slipped out with such ease. Special one, all right. There was something she didn't know, something about this stop that didn't sit right. He had known something about her, about who she really was, before he even made the stop. His radio conversation hadn't just been a routine check. It had been more. He had recognized her. But how? And why? Zoe's apartment was a sanctuary. At least it used to be. She entered, dropping her keys on the table and locking the door behind her. Her muscles were tight, still tense from the encounter. But the moment she stepped inside, her training kicked in. She needed to regroup. She needed to think. She slipped out of her shoes and walked to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water. Her reflection in the window above the sink stared back at her, tired but still alert, still on edge. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel the weight of everything pressing in, the past, the present, and the future. The officer's dismissive tone, his casual assumption of superiority. It was all too familiar. She had seen it too many times to count. But this time was different. Something about the way he had approached her felt too targeted, too intentional. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call. She glanced at the screen. It was Derek. "Zoe," he said, his voice low and urgent when she answered. "What the hell happened out there?" Zoe leaned against the counter, her eyes scanning the room, her mind working quickly. "Nothing I couldn't handle." "That's not the point," Derek shot back. "You don't get it. We've been tracking that officer. He's got connections, Zoe. Bad ones. The kind you don't want to mess with. He's linked to some shady groups, local political pressure, some unsavory ties." Zoe's heart skipped a beat. She straightened, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's not just some cop with a chip on his shoulder. He's got power, connections, influence. And it's not just the usual stuff. This guy plays in the big leagues." Derek paused, his voice dropping. "He's connected to people who don't play by the rules. He's been using his badge to protect them." The news hit her like a punch to the gut. Of course it wasn't just a random traffic stop. She had felt it in her bones. The way he'd looked at her, the way he'd spoken. It was a power move, a calculated move. "What are we going to do?" Zoe asked, her voice tight. "We'll dig into it. You need to lay low for now. Don't make any more moves until we can get a clearer picture of what you're up against." Zoe's mind raced. Lay low. She couldn't. Not with what she now knew. Not when she was this close to uncovering something that could tear this whole system apart. I'm not backing down, she said firmly. This stops now. The next few days passed in a blur. Zoe kept a low profile, but every time she stepped outside, she felt eyes on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the officer was watching her every move. He had made a mistake, though a critical one. He had underestimated her, underestimated the depths of her resolve. But now, she had to outsmart him. She had to be smarter than he was. The game had changed, and it wasn't just about a random traffic stop anymore. This was bigger. This was personal. The officer had made one mistake that would cost him everything. He had underestimated Zoe Adams, and that Zoe knew would be his downfall. Zoe couldn't stop thinking about the officer. His voice echoed in her mind, but it was his eyes that haunted her. The look he gave her before he walked away, that subtle flicker of recognition, had been too deliberate, too pointed. She had felt it deep in her bones that this wasn't just a random encounter. And the longer she let it sit, the more she was convinced that she was being watched. But she couldn't just sit around and wait for him to make the next move. Zoe had never been one to wait for an attack. She was trained to be proactive, to gather intel and strike before the enemy had time to react. If she was going to take down this corrupt system, she needed to act fast. Derek's warning was still fresh in her mind. This officer isn't just some bad cop. He's connected to powerful people, dangerous people. Zoe knew she had to learn more, and she couldn't rely on her usual channels. If Derek was right, the officer was surrounded by an untouchable network. She needed to get creative. It wasn't until she was alone in her apartment that the idea struck her, a dangerous idea, one that could either give her the upper hand or make her a target. She needed to get inside the system, see how deep the corruption went. And she knew the perfect place to start, his department. The next morning, Zoe pulled on a fitted black blazer, the kind she could move in without drawing too much attention. She glanced at herself in the mirror, adjusting her hair. It wasn't exactly a disguise, but it was close enough. She'd worked her way through covert operations before, sleuthing through government files, hacking into databases, setting up covert meetings. This, though, was different. This was a game of infiltration, and the stakes were higher than ever. The officer, she knew, would be working today. She was counting on that. She couldn't afford to wait. She arrived at the precinct around noon. The building was stark and imposing, the kind of place that felt like it had been designed to intimidate rather than serve. Zoe could feel the weight of the building pressing in on her as she stepped through the doors, her boots echoing in the empty lobby. The air smelled sterile, antiseptic, a far cry from the heat outside. She approached the front desk, where an officer sat behind a thick glass window, staring at a computer screen. She offered a professional smile and leaned forward slightly. "I'm here for an internship opportunity," she said, voice calm and collected. The lie slipped off her tongue easily. She had done this before, lied her way into restricted spaces to get what she needed. This wasn't the first time she'd had to become someone else. The officer looked up, his eyebrows raised. He wasn't buying it, but it didn't matter. Zoe's eyes were steady, her posture relaxed but confident. She knew the game. She had to press on. "Internship," he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "We don't just hand those out." Zoe smiled again, this time with more warmth, as if she were trying to disarm him. "It's part of a community program," she explained, her voice smooth. "I'm here to learn more about local policing and law enforcement practices. It's part of a larger initiative from the state." The officer paused, then shrugged and glanced down at his papers. "Fine. You can go upstairs and fill out some paperwork. Don't expect anyone to talk to you. This place doesn't offer that kind of training." She nodded, making a mental note of his dismissive tone. It wasn't a direct rejection, but she knew better than to expect an easy path. She needed information, not approval. Zoe made her way up to the second floor, where the officers' desks were scattered in the open office space. It was a labyrinth of cubicles and filing cabinets. She moved quickly, her footsteps light but purposeful. She passed several officers in the hallway, their eyes flicking over her in barely concealed curiosity. She didn't look back. Her goal was simple: to find the officer who had pulled her over. Her pulse quickened when she spotted him in the far corner of the room. He was seated at a desk, typing something into his computer. He hadn't seen her yet. Zoe took a deep breath and approached him slowly, keeping her movements fluid and natural. The last thing she needed was to tip him off. She came to a stop just behind his desk, pretending to look over some paperwork pinned to the wall. A brief glance was all it took to see his name on the badge, Officer Martin Reed. His name. She didn't waste any more time. She cleared her throat, just loud enough to catch his attention. Reed looked up, his eyes narrowing when he saw her standing there. His expression shifted, just a flicker of recognition before his usual dismissiveness returned. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat cold. Zoe didn't flinch. "I was just wondering if you could point me in the direction of the internship coordinator," she asked, playing the part of confused newcomer. "I'm a little lost." Reed's eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, something unreadable in his gaze. But then he shifted in his chair and pointed toward the back of the room. "It's down the hall, right next to the supply closet." Zoe nodded and smiled politely, but as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something small, but it stuck with her. His hands, now resting on the edge of his desk, were shaking slightly. Only a few months ago, she would have dismissed it as nothing. But now, after everything that had happened, the slightest sign of nervousness felt like a crack in the armor. She lingered by the doorway for a moment, her mind running through every detail. Reed wasn't as untouchable as he wanted to believe. Zoe left the precinct an hour later, feeling the weight of what she'd just done. She hadn't gotten anything concrete yet, but she'd learned something. The officer wasn't just an ordinary cop. He was hiding something. The tension in his hands had been telling, a clue that he was walking a fine line. She didn't know exactly what he was involved in, but one thing was certain. She was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. And whatever it was big. She couldn't back down now. The days that followed were a blur of careful observation. Zoe moved through them like a shadow, quiet, unnoticed, but always alert. The encounter with Officer Reed had left her restless, a gnawing feeling that she was standing on the edge of something much bigger than a single corrupt cop. The tremors of his nervousness had confirmed what she had suspected. Reed was tied to something dangerous. But Zoe was patient. She didn't make any rash moves. She had learned long ago that the most dangerous mistakes were born from haste. She needed to learn more. She needed to find cracks in the system and slip through them undetected. She spent hours poring over public records, pulling up every piece of information she could find on Reed, his professional history, his background, even the cases he had worked on. At first glance, his record seemed clean, too clean in fact. No red flags, no misconduct on file. But the silence spoke volumes. There was a lack of information that felt intentional, a controlled narrative. Zoe's fingers moved swiftly over her laptop, accessing connections within her network, pulling data from sources that most people didn't even know existed. She had learned to navigate these shadowy corners of the internet, to find the truth buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and corruption. A few hours later, she found what she was looking for, a trail of suspicious donations linked to politicians and business interests she recognized immediately. Reed had been a part of a special task force, one that operated under radar, often outside the law, on the guise of high-priority cases. The money trail led to some of the most powerful figures in the city, figures who were involved in shady deals, laundering schemes, and political cover-ups. This was bigger than just Reed. This was systemic. Zoe leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The pieces were starting to fit together. This wasn't just about an officer with a power complex. This was about a network of corruption, a web that reached deep into local politics and law enforcement. And Reed? He was just a cog in the machine. But Zoe had a hunch that he was a critical one. He wasn't just a soldier for the system. He was someone who could lead her to the heart of it. Her phone buzzed, pulling her for her thoughts. It was Derek. "We got intel. You were right. Reed's linked to a larger operation. A task force working under the radar. We need to move fast. Keep your head down, Zoe." Zoe didn't reply immediately. She couldn't afford to draw attention. Not now. But the urgency in Derek's message was clear. She had already learned too much. Now, the question was what to do with it. The answer, she knew, was to go after the people behind the task force. If she exposed them, it would unravel everything. Reed, the politicians, the criminals they protected. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed leverage, a way to force their hand before they could silence her. And she knew exactly where to start. The following day, Zoe returned to the precinct. This time, she had a different strategy in mind. She wasn't there to play the part of an intern anymore. She was going to make them see her, really see her. If Reed had underestimated her before, now it was time for him to realize just how much a mistake that had been. The precinct was quieter than usual when she arrived, and the oppressive air from the previous visit seemed thicker today. Zoe made her way to the hallway leading to the officer's desk. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. She didn't try to avoid the stairs this time. In fact, she leaned into them. People were starting to take notice, and that was exactly what she wanted. When she saw Reed at his desk again, typing away, Zoe didn't hesitate. She approached him directly, standing just a few feet away, waiting for him to acknowledge her. The air between them felt charged, the tension palpable. Reed looked up slowly, his face twisting into a scowl when he saw her standing there. The wariness in his eyes was unmistakable now. "You again," he said, his tone clipped. "I need to talk to you," Zoe said, her voice low but firm. She wasn't going to back down. "And I think you know why." Reed's gaze shifted briefly to the side, and Zoe could see his jaw tighten. He wasn't going to make this easy. "What's this about?" he asked, but Zoe could hear the uncertainty beneath his words. "You've been busy, haven't you?" she asked, her voice rising just a little, enough to draw attention. "Making sure the right people stay protected. Making sure no one looks too closely at your activities." Reed's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, Zoe saw the mask slip. She saw the fear that he tried so hard to hide, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold indifference. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice hardening. Zoe stepped closer, her voice a whisper but sharp as a knife. "You don't want to play this game with me. You're not as untouchable as you think." Reed's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "You're stepping into things you don't understand. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I'm beginning to get an idea," Zoe said, her eyes never leaving his. "And I'm not going to stop until I bring this whole thing down." For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. But then Reed did something Zoe hadn't expected. He smiled, a cold, empty smile. "You really think you can just waltz in here and dismantle everything?" he asked, his voice low. "You don't have the power to stop this." "No one does." Zoe's heart skipped a beat. She had struck a nerve. But Reed wasn't giving up. "No one?" she echoed, her tone incredulous. "You think no one can take you down?" Reed's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You'll see," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll see just how far this goes. And when you're at the bottom, you'll regret trying to make yourself a target." Zoe stared at him for a long moment, weighing her next words carefully. Then, with deliberate calm, she said, "I'm not scared of you or your system. You'll be the one at the bottom when this is over. And I'm going to make sure of it." Without waiting for a response, Zoe turned and walked out of the room, her heart pounding. She knew Reed was a part of something bigger. She knew he was dangerous. But now she had him rattled, and that meant the tide was turning. Zoe left the precinct with the weight of her confrontation with Reed hanging heavily over her. But despite the tension in the air, there was something else, a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a feeling that she wasn't just a small piece in someone else's game anymore. She was the one in control, pulling the strings, pushing back against a system that had always tried to bury her. But the fight was far from over. She knew this was only the beginning. The officer had revealed his hand, his arrogance, his belief that no one could touch him. But Zoe wasn't fooled. That cocky smile, that dismissive attitude, they were his armor, his last defense against the truth coming to light. And truth had a way of breaking even the strongest armor. Zoe didn't stop to rest. She couldn't afford to. Derek's message the night before still echoed in her mind. We need to move fast. Keep your head down, Zoe. But Derek didn't know just how deeply she had already dug. She wasn't going to sit back and let this play out behind closed doors. She needed answers. She needed more leverage. She gathered everything she had: public records, confidential documents, covert intel. Each piece was a fragment of a much larger puzzle, and she could feel the pieces slowly falling into place. But there were still gaps. Big gaps. Reed's connections were too deep, his shadowy task force too well protected. She needed to go deeper, get inside the system in a way that no one would expect. That's when Zoe got the idea. It wasn't just about Reed. It wasn't just about him hiding in the shadows, pulling strings from behind a desk. It was about who was above him, the people who had given him his power, the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes. She couldn't expose the system without going straight to the top. The following day, Zoe took a different approach. She began quietly visiting the people who might have information on Reed's operations. It wasn't easy. These were people who had been entrenched in the system for years, people who had grown comfortable with the corruption around them. But Zoe wasn't afraid. She wasn't just a head of special forces. She was someone who could move in the shadows, gather intel without anyone realizing she was there. Her first stop was an old contact, Hannah, a former journalist who had spent years covering political corruption. Zoe met her in a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. Hannah's eyes were tired, her expression worn, but there was still a fire inside her. Zoe knew she was the right person to talk to. I know who's behind it, Hannah said, her voice low as Zoe slid into the booth across from her. I've been tracking these guys for years. But you're right to be cautious. Reed is a piece of the puzzle, but the people at the top are the ones you should be worried about. Zoe leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Who are they? Hannah glanced around, making sure no one was listening before she continued. It's not just about Reed, Zoe. He's the enforcer, the muscle, the money men. The ones pulling the strings are the real power players. There's a group of local politicians, business owners, and former law enforcement officers. They've created this underground network. The task force you're looking into? They're just a front, a way to keep everything under the radar while they launder money, protect their interests, and keep the public in the dark. Zoe's heart raced as she absorbed the information. It was worse than she'd thought. The task force wasn't just a rogue operation. It was part of a massive system of control, one that had been operating in plain sight for years, hidden behind a veil of politics and influence. How do I get to them? Zoe asked, her voice cold and determined. Hannah hesitated, looking over her shoulder once more. You won't get to them easily. They've got too many layers of protection. But there is one thing you can do. There's a secret meeting coming up. It's their way of keeping everything in line, making sure no one steps out of line. You get in there, you gather intel, and you expose them for what they really are. But be careful. Once you're in, there's no going back. Zoe's mind was already racing through the possibilities. She knew this was the break she'd been waiting for. The meeting could give her everything she needed to bring this whole network down. But there was one problem. She didn't know who could be trusted. Everyone in the system had their own agenda, and Zoe had learned long ago that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. I'll take the risk, Zoe said, her voice firm. I'll find a way in. Hannah nodded, then slid a piece of paper across the table. This is a location. They meet at a warehouse on the outskirts of town. I don't know exactly when, but I know it'll be soon. Zoe pocketed the paper, standing up. Thanks, Hannah. This is what I needed. As she left the coffee shop, the adrenaline kicked in. She had a plan. She had a target. And she had no intention of backing down now. That night, Zoe prepared. She went through her gear, double-checking everything. Her weapons, her tools, her communications. This wasn't a mission she could afford to fail. The meeting would be her chance to get inside the system, to see the faces of the people who had been hiding in the shadows for too long. But she wasn't naive. She knew the risks. If she was caught, if she was exposed, everything she had worked for would be lost. Her team, her career, everything she had built, it would all come crashing down. But Zoe had never been afraid of the odds. She had faced down enemies far more dangerous than this. She was going to bring them all down, and she wasn't going to stop until she did. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking, dilapidated structure on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect setting for a meeting of criminals, a place where the shadows could swallow secrets whole. Zoe had arrived early, her car parked in the alley, hidden from the view of anyone who might be watching. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete. The cities hummed distant in the background. She double-checked her equipment. The small earpiece was in place, the micro camera securely attached beneath the collar of her jacket, her gun holstered beneath her arm. She ran through her plan one last time in her head. She needed to get in, gather intel, and get out undetected. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing ever was when dealing with people like this. But she had trained for this. She had spent years preparing for moments like this, where her life and the fate of so many others hung in the balance. As she moved toward the entrance of the warehouse, Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air was too still, too quiet. The silence seemed to stretch out in front of her, like the calm before the storm. She pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. There would be time for second-guessing later. Right now, she needed to stay sharp. Zoe crouched low as she reached the building's side, her breath steady but quick. She crept toward a small window, barely wide enough for her to peek through, and tried to get a sense of what was happening inside. Her eyes scanned the shadows within, searching for movement. Then she saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness. Reed, the officer she had been tracking for days. Her heart skipped a beat. She'd expected to find some of the network's big players at this meeting, but she hadn't expected Reed. She thought he was just a pawn in the game, someone too far down the chain to be at the table with the people pulling the strings. But here he was, stepping through the door like he owned the place. Zoe's pulse quickened, her fingers tightening around the gun at her side. She had to act fast. She needed to get closer, to hear what was being said. Reed's presence here meant the task force was much deeper than she thought. If he was involved with the inner circle, it meant he knew everything. She moved cautiously, staying low to the ground as she made her way around to the back of the warehouse. There was a service door at the rear. Zoe quickly checked for any signs of movement before slipping inside. The interior of the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from a few dim overhead bulbs. She could hear voices in the distance, but the conversations were too muffled for her to make out. She crept forward, inching her way toward the group of men gathered around a long table in the center of the room. There were at least 5 men, all of them dressed in dark suits, their faces partially obscured by shadows. Zoe recognized a few of them from her research. They were local politicians, business owners, men who had built their wealth and influence on the backs of people like her, the people who had rigged the system, who had used their power to trample on everyone beneath them. Zoe moved closer, staying low and out of sight. Her breath came shallow now, her heart pounding in her ears. She had to be patient. One wrong move, one sound too loud, and everything would fall apart. She could hear their voices more clearly now, each word sharper than the last. The tone was calculating, deliberate. They weren't just talking about money or power. They were talking about control. This isn't just about the task force anymore, one of the men said, his voice deep and calm. We need to expand, get the right people in place, make sure we're untouchable. Zoe's ears perked up. This was it. This was the information she needed. And Reed? Another man asked. His voice was laced with suspicion. He's reliable, but can we trust him? He's still too much of a loose cannon. Reed's voice cut through the tension. I've been with you long enough to know how this works, he said, his tone unwavering. I know the game and I know what's at stake. You don't need to worry about me. I'll keep things in line. The man who had questioned him was silent for a moment, but Zoe could hear the quiet rustle of papers being shuffled. You're right. We can't afford mistakes. Not now. But you need to keep an eye on the woman. She's getting too close. Zoe froze, every muscle in her body going taut at the mention of her name. The woman, the one they were talking about, was her. She had underestimated Reed. She had thought he was just a piece on the chessboard, a pawn that could be pushed aside. But now it was clear. He had known all along. He had been playing her just as much as she'd been playing him. She had thought she could get close without him noticing. She had thought she was the one in control, but he had been watching her every move. The betrayal hit her like a punch to the gut. Reed's voice again, low and dangerous. "I'll take care of her. She won't get in the way again." Zoe's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment of truth. She had to make a choice. She could wait, gather more evidence, and risk exposing herself further. Or she could act now, before Reed had the chance to silence her for good. She didn't hesitate. Zoe moved swiftly, her body reacting before her mind even had time to catch up. She pulled out her gun and leveled it at the group of men, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "Don't move." The room fell into a stunned silence. The men froze, their eyes wide as they slowly turned toward her. Zoe's eyes met Reed's. The cold mask he wore now cracked, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. "You really thought you could silence me?" she said, her voice unwavering. "You underestimated me, Reed, and now you're going to pay the price." Reed's face twisted with anger, but he didn't move. Not yet, but Zoe could see it. The shift in the room, the tension rising. These men weren't used to being challenged. They were used to being the ones in control. But now, for the first time, they were looking into the eyes of someone who was afraid to tear their world apart. "You don't know what you're messing with," one of the men growled. "This is bigger than you." Zoe smiled coldly. "Maybe, but it's over now." She wasn't prepared for what came next. Before she could react, Reed lunged at her, his arm shooting out to knock the gun from her hand. The room erupted into chaos. Zoe's heart raced, but she kept her focus. She kicked out, knocking Reed off balance, and managed to grab her gun back just in time. "Don't think you're getting away with this," Reed snarled, his breath ragged. But Zoe had no intention of letting him walk away. Not this time. "Take them all down," she commanded. Now. The chaos in the warehouse swirled around Zoe like a violent storm. Reed had fallen back, temporarily disoriented by her swift retaliation. But now he was recovering. The men around the table were on their feet, some reaching for weapons, others backing into the shadows, unsure what to do next. But none of them dared to make a move, at least not yet. Zoe stood firm, gun still in hand, eyes never leaving Reed. The betrayal, the realization that had been playing her all along, still burned in her chest, but she pushed it aside. Right now, there was no room for emotion. The only thing that mattered was taking control of the situation. "You thought you could pull the wool over my eyes, Reed," Zoe said, her voice low and cold, her finger tight on the trigger. "But you made one mistake, underestimating me." Reed's eyes flickered with something darker, anger, fear, desperation. "You think this is over? You think you can bring all of us down with a gun?" His words were strained, but there was a hint of something more. Panic. Zoe's gaze never wavered as she motioned toward the other men, who had stayed eerily still. "You're done. All of you." Her voice held an edge of finality. "I've got what I need. Your time is up." Reed, still recovering his composure, took a step toward her. "You don't know what you're dealing with. The people we're involved with, they won't let you take us down. You think they're going to stand by and let you ruin everything." Zoe's mind raced, connecting the dots from everything she'd uncovered. The network of power and corruption, the political figures, the business elites. Reed had been right about one thing. This was bigger than just him. But that didn't matter anymore. She was already in too deep to back out. "Then let them try," Zoe said, her voice unwavering. She turned her attention to the group of men. "You don't scare me." Reed took another step toward her, but this time Zoe was faster. She aimed her gun at him, the sharp click of the safety being released loud in the silence. He froze. "Not another step," she warned. For a moment, the room was still. The air was thick with tension, with the knowledge that one wrong move could end in disaster. Zoe could feel the weight of every second. It was a standoff, a dangerous, unpredictable standoff. And then, in the quiet that followed, a voice echoed from behind her. It was Derek. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice calm, but with steady undercurrent of authority. Zoe glanced over her shoulder. Derek, along with a few of her trusted team members, had silently entered the warehouse, their weapons drawn. They had been tracking her, keeping watch from a distance, ready to move when she gave the signal. But Zoe didn't want backup. Not right now. "I told you not to come in," she said, her eyes narrowing. "I need this to be clean." Derek's expression was unreadable. "It's too late for that now." Zoe took a slow breath, then slowly lowered her gun. Though she didn't release it from her grip, her focus remained entirely on Reed, on the men standing by his side. "You can arrest them now," she said, her tone finally breaking the sharp edge of the standoff. "I've got everything I need." Derek moved quickly, signaling his team to surround the men, to disarm them and secure the warehouse. Reed, seeing the shift in power, finally looked defeated. His confidence, his arrogance, began to crumble, leaving only the raw, exposed fear that Zoe had seen earlier. His eyes, once filled with that simmering fury, now flickered with something far less dangerous: desperation. "You don't understand," Reed muttered, his voice breaking. "This isn't just about me. It's about everything. Everything you've been fighting for. They'll come for you. You think you can change anything? You can't." Zoe took a step closer to him, her expression hard. "I'm done listening to threats, Reed. You had your chance." She paused, her voice steady and firm. "It's over." She signaled to Derek again. Without hesitation, his team moved in, taking Reed and the others into custody, securing their hands behind their backs with cold efficiency. Zoe stood there for a moment, watching the men she had just exposed be let out in handcuffs. She could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her. The job wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but it felt like a victory. The kind of victory that tasted bittersweet, the kind that always came at a cost. Later, back in her apartment, Zoe sat alone, her mind racing through the events that had unfolded over the past few days. The mission wasn't finished, far from it, but she had struck a blow. Reed and the rest of the corrupt network were now in the hands of the authorities. It had been messy, it had been dangerous, but it had worked. For the first time in a long while, Zoe allowed herself to lean back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment of peace. But the peace was fleeting. The phone on the table buzzed, breaking the silence. Zoe's heart sank as she picked it up, recognizing the number on the screen. It was Derek. "I know you wanted this to be clean," Derek said, his voice grave, "but there's something you need to know." Zoe's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "There's more," Derek said quietly. "It's not just those men. There's another layer to this, a bigger, more dangerous player. Someone who's been pulling strings behind the scenes, and they're coming for you." Zoe's mind raced. "Who?" Derek didn't respond immediately, his words coming slower now, measured. "We don't know exactly, but they've been watching you, and they know what you've done." Zoe set the phone down, her stomach tightening. She had thought this was the end of the fight, but she had been wrong. This was only the beginning. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting sharp shadows across Zoe's kitchen. The warmth of the sun contrasted with the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She sat at the table, her fingers drumming lightly on the surface as her mind replayed the conversation with Derek. There was always more, wasn't there? It was never just one piece of the puzzle, one corruption, one injustice. The network she had exposed was just a small part of a much larger machine, a machine that had been operated with impunity for years, maybe decades. The thought of it made her skin crawl. Zoe's phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her reverie. This time, it wasn't Derek. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something about it seemed urgent. She picked up the phone, her hand slightly trembling. "Zoe, we need to talk." The voice on the other end was low, cautious. It was Hannah, the journalist who had helped her piece together some of the initial details about Reed's involvement. Zoe's stomach tightened, the feeling of dread creeping up her spine. "What's going on?" Hannah's voice grew quieter, more urgent. "You need to be careful. I've been digging deeper, like I said I would, and I found something you should know. Something about the people you've been going after. You're not just dealing with some rogue officers anymore. This goes all the way to the top, beyond anything you imagined." Zoe felt her breath catch in her throat. Who's at the top, Hannah? What do you mean? There was a long pause, followed by a sharp intake of breath from Hannah. I don't have all the pieces, but I've got enough. The person pulling the strings. It's someone in a position you wouldn't believe. Someone in power, in politics. A senator. Someone with resources and connections that go way beyond just this town. But it's worse than that. They've been using the task force, using Reed, to cover their tracks, to make sure no one ever sees what they're really doing. Zoe stood up, pacing the length of the kitchen as the weight of Hannah's words sank in. Who is it? Zoe demanded, her voice hard. Another long silence, and then, Senator Douglas Hayes. He's behind it all. The name struck Zoe like a slap to the face. Hayes wasn't just any politician. He was a powerful figure, one of the most influential senators in the state, a man who had positioned himself as a pillar of integrity, a crusader for justice and law and order. Zoe had never suspected that someone with so much public respect would be involved in such dark dealings. Zoe's voice was a whisper, barely audible. Are you sure? I'm sure, Hannah said, the certainty in her voice like a slap of reality. I've found evidence, Zoe. Ties to laundering, bribery, even weapons trafficking. He's been funding it all. Through these task forces, through shady organizations, keeping his hands clean while using people like Reed to do the dirty work. Hayes is untouchable, but he's not as invincible as he thinks. Zoe's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in. Hayes was a senator. His reach was vast. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a fight against one of the most powerful men in the state, and he would do anything to protect his empire. I need everything you've got on him, Zoe said, her voice low and determined. I'll send it over. But Zoe, Hannah's voice wavered, the urgency in it evident. Be careful. Hayes has eyes everywhere. He's not going to let you expose him without a fight. People like him don't fall easily. Zoe didn't reply immediately. She was already thinking ahead, her mind racing with strategies and next steps. She couldn't let Hayes get away with this. Not after everything she had seen, everything she had fought for. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. The game had changed, and Zoe had to be smarter, more strategic. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. I'll be careful, Zoe said finally, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Thanks, Hannah. I'll reach out if I need more. As she hung up the phone, Zoe stood there for a long moment, staring out the window at the city below. It was all coming into focus now. The scope of the corruption, the darkness that spread across every level of power. Hayes wasn't just the head of the snake. He was the one who had allowed it to grow, to fester in the shadows. And now, he was coming for her. The next few days passed in a blur of late nights and calculated risks. Zoe knew that the only way to bring Hayes down was to get solid, undeniable evidence. But she also knew that Hayes would be watching. Every step she took, every move she made, was being monitored. The people around her were at risk. Derek, her team, even Hannah. She couldn't afford to let them become targets. Zoe and her team worked in the shadows, using their connections to infiltrate the network and gather the necessary evidence. Derek, as always, was her closest ally, helping coordinate the operation. But even with his help, Zoe knew that Hayes had resources beyond what they could fight. She needed a bombshell, a piece of evidence that would be too explosive for anyone to ignore, the kind of proof that would send shockwaves through the entire political structure. And she knew exactly where to find it. One evening, Zoe arrived at the senator's office building, her mind sharp, her movements deliberate. She had spent days tracking Hayes' routine, learning his habits, the schedule of his staff, the security measures in place. She knew the risks of this mission, but she had no choice. If she was going to expose Hayes, she needed to get inside. With the help of her team, Zoe had already neutralized the exterior security. She moved through the building with the stealth of a shadow, her heart pounding in her chest. The key to everything was Hayes' personal files, the ones kept locked away in a secure office. If she could get to them, she would have everything she needed to bring him down. The door to the office was locked, but that wasn't a problem for Zoe. She had the tools and the skills to bypass most security measures. Within minutes, the lock clicked open, and she stepped inside. The room was dark, quiet, a stark contrast to the polished, professional environment she had just left behind. The files she needed were on a desk in the corner, hidden under a pile of reports. But Zoe knew exactly where to look. She reached for the drawer, sliding it open, her heart racing as she flipped through the documents. And then she found it, a series of encrypted bank transactions, names, and dates linking Hayes directly to the laundering operation. The proof was there, right in front of her. It was everything she needed. But just as she was about to take a photo of the documents, the door to the office creaked open. Zoe spun around, her hand instinctively going to her gun. And there, standing in the doorway, was Senator Hayes himself. The door clicked open, and Zoe's heart stopped. For a moment, everything froze. The air thick with tension, the weight of the discovery in her hands, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Standing in the doorway, framed by the dim light of the hallway, was Senator Douglas Hayes. His expression was calm, almost too calm, as if he had expected this moment to come eventually, as if he had been waiting for her. Zoe's fingers tightened around the gun, but she didn't raise it. Not yet. She had the evidence, the damning documents, clutched tightly in her other hand. The very thing that could destroy him. But Hayes wasn't acting like someone who had just been caught red-handed. His eyes flickered to the drawer where the documents lay exposed, and then back to her. There was no surprise in his gaze, no panic, just cold calculation. "I figured you'd show up eventually," Hayes said, his voice smooth, without a trace of fear. He stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The sound echoed like a warning. Zoe's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground, her grip tightening on the gun as she lowered it slightly. "I have everything I need to take you down," she said, her voice unwavering despite the danger of the moment. "The money, the connections, everything. It's over, Hayes." He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of defeat. It was a smile of someone who knew something she didn't. "You really think you have me cornered, don't you?" Zoe's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" Hayes walked further into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. His eyes never left hers. "You've been digging around in the wrong places, Zoe. You've been following a trail of crumbs. But I don't need to cover my tracks. I make sure nothing happens without my say-so. I've been in this game longer than you've been alive. People like me don't fall. Not like this." Zoe's eyes narrowed. "I don't care how long you've been playing the game. You're going down." He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem concerned. Instead, his gaze drifted to the documents in her hand. "You think these papers are going to stop me? You think this is enough to bring me down? I have every judge, every law enforcement officer, every media outlet wrapped around my finger. You're a pawn in a game you don't even understand." Zoe's heart pounded, but her grip on the gun remained steady. "That's where you're wrong. You may have control, but it's slipping away, and you're going to regret underestimating me." Hayes chuckled, the sound low and dark. "You really think you can expose me? You think anyone is going to believe you over me? You don't even have the power to get this out there. What's your plan? Go to the media? They work for me, Zoe." A cold realization began to set in. He wasn't afraid. He was confident, too confident. Zoe's mind raced. She had to move fast. If Hayes truly had this much control, if his influence reached so far, then she couldn't afford to expose him in the usual way. There had to be another route, a way to take him down that would shake his empire to its core. Without warning, she pulled out her phone, quickly sending a message to Derek. It was a coded signal, one they had worked out in case something went wrong, something to bring everything crashing down in an instant. She wasn't going to be the one to destroy him alone. She needed the world to see Hayes for who he really was, to watch him fall from grace in front of everyone. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as she waited for the response. Hayes didn't seem to notice, his smug confidence filling the room. He was too comfortable in his power, too sure of his position. But that was his mistake. Zoe wasn't just going to take him down with the documents. She had a bigger plan now. She had something that would expose him in the most public, undeniable way possible. The sound of a notification pinged from her phone. Derek's message came through. It's done. The leak is live. They're seeing it now. Zoe's heart skipped a beat, and she allowed herself the briefest of smiles. Hayes might have thought he had everything under control, but now everything was about to unravel. She stood taller, looking Hayes straight in the eye. "You're finished," she said, her voice low, the finality in her words clear. His confident expression faltered, just for a moment, and it was enough to confirm what she had known. For all his power, for all his control, Hayes had made the same mistake that every man like him did. He had underestimated his opponent. "You think this will be enough?" Hayes spat, stepping toward her now, his voice growing more heated. "Do you think the system will let you win? You don't understand. There are too many people who owe me too much." Zoe's smile remained calm, almost pitying. "No, you don't understand. It's over, Hayes. You've just become another part of the system that's about to crumble. The truth is out now. People will believe me. And you'll finally be held accountable for everything." For the first time, Hayes's mask slipped, his anger flared, but the defiance in his posture turned to fear. He took a step back, his eyes darting around as if looking for a way out. But there was no escape. Zoe took another step forward, the gun still steady in her hand, her voice unwavering. "There's nowhere left for you to run." Hours later, the news stations were flooded with breaking stories. The public was watching as Senator Hayes was arrested on charges of corruption, money laundering, bribery, and illegal arms trafficking. The documents Zoe had uncovered, the ones Hayes had thought were inconsequential, had been the tipping point. But it was a bombshell revealed in a media leak that had exposed everything. She had made sure the world would see what Hayes had been hiding. The fall of such a powerful man was swift and brutal. News anchors, government officials, and even former allies of Hayes were forced to answer for their connections to his criminal empire. The system that had protected him for so long was now crumbling piece by piece. Zoe stood in her apartment, staring at the news reports on her screen. She felt the weight of it, the cost of everything she had sacrificed to get here. But there was no satisfaction in the victory. Not yet. Her phone buzzed again. Derek's name appeared on the screen. She answered quickly. "You did it," he said, his voice tired but filled with relief. "You brought him down. You actually did it." Zoe didn't respond immediately. She was watching the footage on the screen, the faces of the men she had exposed, their names flashing across the news. She had won, but the victory felt empty. Hayes was only one part of the problem. His fall was just the beginning of a much larger fight. "Yeah," Zoe said finally, her voice quiet. "But it's not over. Not by a long shot. The battle had been won, but the war was just beginning."